So our last speaker, I'd like to introduce Cleveland native Dan Ruminski, the Cleveland Storyteller. For more than a decade, Cleveland native and renowned storyteller Dan Ruminski has engaged audience of all ages with illuminating tales of the Cleveland's Gilded Age, including the rich history of the families of Millionaires Row and their contributions to the city's growth and development. In addition to storytelling, Dan is a veteran, author, and entrepreneur. He founded Martison Nichols, located in Willoughby, Ohio, where he served as president of the Innovation Floor Mat Solutions Company for more than 25 years. He's appeared frequently on radio and television, as well as numerous magazines and newspaper articles. Since 2008, Dan's Cleveland storytelling events have raised funds and awareness for more than 20 local nonprofit organizations, including more than $50,000 to support individuals with autism. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frank. I think they said I could have this handheld mic.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. My pleasure to be here. I am Dan Ruminski. Last 14 or 15 years, I became known as the Cleveland Storyteller, and not without purpose. If you're a native Clevelander like myself, when you turned on Johnny Carson or Jay Leno or any of the sitcoms throughout the world, Cleveland was always the goat, always made fun of. And I kind of resented that, and finally I got in a position to promote Cleveland through its wonderful, wonderful history. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I do about 70 presentations a year. I've done about 800 over time. I get all kinds of questions about history, but there's one question I get at every talk, and it has nothing to do with history. How tall are you? So for those of you that are remotely interested, I am 6'6" and holding. I thought that'd be enough. It begs the question, did I play basketball? And indeed I did at John Carroll University, and then I played professionally for the United States Army for 1 year. So that being said, they've given me a wonderful chair here. So I'm kind of too tall to stand, so I'm going to sit. If I said to you, Cleveland, Ohio, the greatest, wealthiest city in all the world, you may ask, what Cleveland are you talking about? Well, in the 1870s, Cleveland, Ohio had 1/2 of the world's millionaires. 1/2 of the world's millionaires. And for the most part, they were all neighbors. They all lived on a little street called Euclid Avenue, Millionaires Row. And to get the full impact of Millionaires Row, let's take a little trip from East 9th Street out to East 105th Street, pretty close to where we're at today. 4.5 miles. And visualize mansion after mansion after mansion. 400 mansions. And all on very large properties, sometimes 6 acres, little mini estates. What a marvelous ride. If you drive Euclid Avenue today, it really tests your imagination that was the wealthiest street in all the world. So the 400 families, they not only lived together, they went to church together, they partied together, they went to Europe together, but they decided to form a little cemetery called Lakeview Cemetery, and they're all buried together. Their commitment was eternal. And if you go to Lakeview, you'll see all the names like Rockefeller and Hanna and Mather and White and all the names that you've gotten to know over the years. Euclid Avenue at one point in the 1880s was called the most beautiful, grandest avenue in all the world. Grandest avenue in all the world. And it begs the question, who said that? Well, Frank mentioned his name earlier. Mark Twain called Euclid Avenue the grandest, most beautiful avenue in all the world. How did he know? I taught history. I never put Mark Twain in Cleveland. Well, he was invited in to speak by a family called Severance. And you probably know that name. And he came in for a couple of weeks, spent time with the Severances, and decided to go to Europe with several of the families from Millionaires Row. And while in Europe, he wrote a wonderful book, which is still around today, obviously. So he also saw the great avenues of London or Paris or Moscow. And he concluded, our Euclid Avenue here in Cleveland, Ohio, the grandest, most beautiful in all the world. It was a genuine neighborhood. They have an event that lasted from 1875 to 1910 called the Euclid Avenue Sleigh Races. And 6 weeks every winter was sleighing season. And these were cutter sleighs, very small, very fast, and the horses were trotters, beautiful animals. And they would meet at East 40th informally every afternoon for 6 weeks, and they'd race down to East 9th to see who had the fastest horse. And it got so competitive, they started breeding horses for speed, and we had world champion after world champion because of the sleigh races. And if you drive that corridor from East 40th to East 9th, it's quite a distance. And thousands of people lined that avenue to see the sleigh races. And there was betting going on and obviously drinking. It was a very festive time. The people that lived on the avenue, like Rockefeller or Hanna or Mather or White, were celebrities. And human nature craves celebrity, but back then we didn't have movie stars or sports stars. It was the folks on Euclid Avenue that were world famous. So you could show up for the sleigh races and see Rockefeller and his brother William racing. You could see your celebrities up close, and it was a marvelous thing. The city was very cooperative. They raised the speed limit from 5 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour just for the sleigh races. And they blocked off all the side streets. And obviously, when it ended in 1910, it was because of automobiles. So that wonderful history came to an end. We had a marvelous invention in Cleveland and marvelous greatness. And I decided one day to study greatness. I wondered about its origins. Greatness' origin is not always obvious. Sometimes greatness starts from a little incidental event, something that you would never think would lead to greatness. And I want to give you an example that happened in Cleveland. That is one of a million stories that I think led to greatness. And it involves, of all things, a little candy. A little candy. How could a little candy lead to greatness? Well, it wasn't any little candy. It's invented in 1900. It's still around today. One of the best known brands in all the world. I'll give you a hint. It has a hole in the middle. You would know it as Lifesavers. Clarence Crane invented Lifesaver. He and his father were in the chocolate business, and they did very well. But in the summer, with no refrigeration, chocolates were a mess. So he invented a hard candy, which we know as Lifesaver. Folklore suggests that the hole in the middle was because if a youngster swallowed the candy, they could still breathe. I think that probably is just folklore, but it's out there. And Clarence started out in Garrettsville, Ohio, brought his Lifesaver to Cleveland. Everything didn't go smoothly, as business sometimes doesn't. He initially packaged the candy in cardboard, and the cardboard sucked all the flavor out of the candy. So he had to repackage. And today, if you get your Lifesaver, you pull a string and the foil comes up, and you go down and pick your favorite flavor, which we did as kids. Lifesaver didn't have flavors initially, they were all mint. And the customer in Cleveland were all the bars in Cleveland, sold Lifesavers. That was because when the men got their checks on Friday and went out drinking, they would take a Lifesaver, and when the wife smelled their breath at home, they'd say, "Yes, darling, I was not drinking this evening." Some things never change. But that's how Lifesaver got its start. And Clarence's business grew, and there was a fella up in New York by the name of Ed Noble. Ed Noble was in business. The Millionaire's Row was known throughout the world. Obviously, we didn't have internet and television and phones. We had postcards. Millions and millions of postcards. Rockefeller's mansion on East 40th in Euclid was the favorite. And you'd have a picture on the front and then advertising on the back, a pretty good business venture. So Ed was in that business, and he heard about Lifesaver, and he came to Cleveland, and he made one big mistake. He tasted the candy. And he loved it so much, he bought the company for $3,000. You might have thought Clarence got gypped, but he didn't. Back then, you could buy a house for $3,000, and Clarence was happy. Clarence wasn't done retired. He settled in Chagrin Falls. Maybe many of you have been in Chagrin Falls, and you've been to a restaurant called Gamekeepers. That was Clarence Crane's hotel. And they entertained John Rockefeller in Chagrin Falls. So Ed took Lifesaver. He figured out during the Great Depression there were two items that were recession-proof: alcohol and candy. And he had one of the two. So the Great Depression, he saved several $1 million, which is a phenomenal feat based on a little candy with a hole in the middle. And he decided with these several $1 million, it was time to buy another company. And you've had access to this company all your life. You may have had access to it sometime during the day, never realizing that it had a Cleveland connection or even a Lifesaver connection. So what was it that Clarence bought? He bought ABC, American Broadcasting Company. So my point on greatness, you start out with little candy and then you follow the steps. And it leads to something much bigger. You take that and you multiply it by 1 million. That made Cleveland the wealthiest city in all the world, with half the world's millionaires. Cleveland had great theater, as we do today. Back in 1882, a group was going to build a phenomenal opera house on the corner of East 4th and Euclid. Going to be one of the best opera houses in the country. All marble, red seats, beautiful chandeliers, the epitome. And the paper of the day, the Plain Dealer, was mocking the project. They said it would never, ever be successful. And it begs the question, why would the paper do this? Cleveland's going to get one of the finest opera houses, if not the finest opera house in the country, and the paper's beating up the project. Why would they do that? Well, again, keeping in mind on the corner of East 4th and Euclid, they said it would never be successful because it was too far out in the country. East 4th and Euclid. Now, I can't say they were farming in that intersection, but there were orchards and trees and cows. And indeed, the Opera House was built. If you've been to that restaurant, Pickwick and Frolic, you've been on the grounds of the old East 4th Opera House. And they do have some memorabilia there if you look on the walls. So now you know the rest of the story. Many famous people appeared there, include John Barrymore, more at my era, but Drew Barrymore is still around today. That would have been her grandfather. And John Barrymore also appeared in the old Cleveland Playhouse, which was located next to the Cleveland Clinic before they went downtown. Marvelous playhouse. So you'd go and sit in the Drury Theater, 800 people. You could have dinner there and park and not have to go downtown. But all things come to an end, and the Playhouse decided to move downtown, and I understand. Barrymore was in a play in 1929 at the Cleveland Playhouse called Bards of Richard. And that title probably means nothing to you. But there's a line in that play that actually is more famous than the play itself. King Richard loses his horse in battle. And he holds up his sword and he said, my kingdom for a horse. A horse that, to that point, he probably took for granted. That thing got me thinking. He took it for granted until he lost it. And I wondered in life, how many things do we take for granted until we lose them? Things we don't even think about. Well, you're probably much like myself. Younger people come up to me and ask advice on business, and they're all looking for a silver bullet, and we know there's no such animal. But the only advice I can give is that opportunity is not always obvious. Let's say, for the sake of example, we don't know that a young soldier saw King Richard in trouble, was able to get a horse, get the king on the horse, and get him out of battle safely. Now he'd have to find the horse, he'd have to be very astute in weaving his way through battle and getting King Richard on the horse, but getting him out safely. Opportunity came out of nowhere. Do you think he had any trouble with his career from that point on? I think not. And so often that's what happens with opportunity. Well, the Drury Theater is packed. John Barrymore's on stage. The end of the play is my kingdom for a horse. Standing room only. Over 800 people paid to hear Barrymore say that line. And just about as he was starting to say the line, a huge fella in the front row let out a big belch. And it rang throughout the theater. Every person knew what happened. And as you could imagine, the crowd started snickering. And then it was full-blown laughter. Here you have one of the most famous thespians in the country standing there, and he can't deliver the line in full costume because he lost the audience. He knew eventually it would come to an end, and indeed, 15, 20 minutes maybe, he's standing there. The audience finally settled down. And he decided, in his wisdom and in his professionalism, not to deliver the line as written. He didn't say, my kingdom for a horse. So what was it he said? He said, get a saddle for that horse's ass. You know what happened in Cleveland? John Barrymore got the longest standing ovation of his entire career here in Cleveland. It was the Drury Theater. I knew Francis Drury's great-grandson, and his mother was at that play in 1929. She witnessed it. But it's in a book about Barrymore, that in Cleveland, Ohio, at the Cleveland Playhouse, he got the longest standing ovation in his career. Opportunity. That was an potentially embarrassing opportunity. He flipped it and turned it into a home run. Not always predictable. One of the things that I want to look at Euclid Avenue, with all this wealth, what was the stabilizing factor? Euclid Avenue had more than 20 churches mixed in, and the church played a big role in most of the families. But I wondered, how do you raise children with that much wealth? How do you get them to be ambitious, to be motivated? You know, you and I went shopping as kids at Higbee's. They went to Europe to buy their clothes. They took a steamer, went over to Europe. They belonged to the best clubs, like the Union Club and the University Club. They had servants. They had everything at their beck and call. How do you keep those children motivated? And some families were very successful, others weren't, but there was a family in particular that I admired, and it was founded by Thomas Howard White. And that name may sound familiar. Thomas Howard was the founder of the White Sewing Machine Company. Number 2, the singer. And he employed 2,000 people here in Cleveland building sewing machines. And eventually with his sons, he founded the White Motor Company, one of the biggest builders of trucks and buses in the world. And Thomas Howard was raised in New England, and his family was in manufacturing business, and he too wanted to go into business. And he knew he needed $200 to start a business. He didn't even know what the business was, but he figured he needed $200. He made $25 a month, so you can imagine, even with part-time jobs, to save $200 was quite a feat. But eventually he did. And it was time to go into business. But he didn't. He realized that after doing that, he needed another $200. And you may say, well, Dan, you just contradicted yourself. You said he needed $200 to go into business. What was the other $200 for? Well, it was a New England tradition based on their religion that before you left home, you had to pay back your parents for all the wonderful things they did for you. I have 4 of those little rascals, and that caught my eye. So much so, after I read it, I called them all in and I told them the story. And I waited a couple months, and no check was forthcoming. So I wrote a book, and I put the story in a book, and I highlighted it in yellow magic marker, and I put a post-it note in there, please read. Called them all in, dropped it off. Waited a couple months, no check forthcoming. So a couple of years ago, my youngest Danny, I was speaking at a place called the Steel Mansion out in Painesville, which is a marvelous place. My son Danny wanted to come, and he said, "Dad, I'm going to want to say a few words before you speak. May I do that?" And I said, "By all means," because keep in mind I had witnesses. And he got up and he said, "Dad, I wanted you and your audience to know that we took your talk very seriously. We read the story. And in fact, we opened it up and we read the book. And we all got together and we discussed this. We wanted you to know that we listened to what you say." But he said, "I've been appointed tonight to let you know that no check will be forthcoming." And indeed, he was honest. No check has been forthcoming. But that was Thomas Howard White. He migrates to Cleveland, builds a wonderful house about east 72nd and Euclid, not too far from here. If you want to have fun sometimes, drive or walk from Euclid to Carnegie, and you get an idea how big the properties were that these houses were on. And they had a wonderful pond on the property. And the older boys, he had 8 children. Thomas Howard was a Renaissance man. He was the kind of man that when he spoke, you listened to every word. It seemed like every word was perfectly chosen. He didn't waste words. He was religious. He believed in government. He was on the city council. He was charitable. But the one thing that he believed in beyond anything else was one's reputation. And he drummed that into his children. Protect your reputation. Do not do anything to jeopardize your reputation. How farsighted was he today when reputations are so often in the news? He didn't know about social media, obviously, but he understood what damage to one's reputation could do. Something that maybe I said casually 5 years ago, and all of a sudden it comes back to haunt you, because maybe I didn't think it out as well as I should. So this was a constant theme in the house, one's reputation, one's reputation. To give you an idea what kind of parent he was, the older boys were playing with these toy boats in a pond on the property, and the youngest was Walter. We'll call him Little Snot-Nose for the sake of our story. He was about 8 years old. And he realized he didn't have his own boat. And the older boys were having a great time, and he doesn't have a boat. Now, this 8-year-old wasn't going to go casually up to his father and ask for a boat. He thought about this. And he walked up to his father, and keep in mind, he's 8 years old, Little Snot-Nose. And he said, "Father, have you thought about buying me a boat?" What a wonderful question from an 8-year-old. Put the onus on his father. And Thomas Howard, we said, never wasted words. In this case, he was very succinct. No. This didn't please little Walter. Little Snot-Nose walked away respectfully, but somewhat angry. And then he thought about it. And then he came back. And he said, "Father, if you're not going to buy me a boat, I'm going to build my own boat." Remember we talked about ambition. What a wonderful, wonderful response. And Thomas Howard wasn't done. He said, "Son, if you're going to build your own boat, I'm going to buy you a wonderful set of tools." That struck me as wonderful parenting. Now, what happened to Little Snot-Nose in his life? Well, he moved forward. He becomes the president of the White Motor Company. During World War I, he was hired by the Allies to coordinate all mechanized transportation for the Allies. Armies going from horse and mule to mechanized. You can imagine, even in peacetime, the chore that would be. There are no parts depots, no mechanics, nothing. And then you have lack of transportation, and Walter was hired to do that. The White Motor Company built 18,000 vehicles for the war effort. Without Cleveland, that war would have gone on a lot longer, and yet in no history book does Cleveland, Ohio get credit for any of the above. Walter retired to a lavish estate out in Chesterland, Ohio. You would know that today. His honey is Hawken High School. And it was marvelous, and he basically was very successful on the estate and took White Motor Company to one of the biggest companies in all the world. So a lot of that I attribute to great parenting. I know we're kind of under a time thing here, and I want to conclude with something that maybe will be food for thought, because we're here at Botanical Gardens in this wonderful, wonderful area. One of the things I get asked on occasion is, why should we study the millionaires at Millionaires Row? Why should we study the Gilded Age? They all had wealth, they had great lives. What have they done for us lately? Which seems to be a question today, this self. What have they done for us lately? So I want you to envision, if you would, a little different Cleveland, Ohio. Something that I think would be a trouble getting used to. And I'm going to, the vision is going to include everything that the millionaires did for Cleveland and are still around today. So let's envision a Cleveland without Rockefeller Park, that wonderful drive that many of you came in. Let's envision Cleveland without Botanical Gardens. They wouldn't be here without the millionaires. Let's take away the Cleveland Orchestra. Let's take away the Art Museum. Let's take away the Cleveland Clinic. Let's take away University Hospital, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the United Way. Oh, let's take away Case Western Reserve University already. So I don't think I have to go on. And they were all great business people. They set up endowments for all these things, and these things are sustainable, so that not only our children, but our grandchildren and their grandchildren will be able to go to the orchestra, or go to the clinic, or go to University Hospital, or drive that wonderful drive up Rockefeller Park, or the Emerald Necklace. So history does make sense, and it seems to me that we owe a gratitude to these wonderful people. And if you're like me, periodically I go to Lakeview Cemetery and I thank them for the wonderful city that we all live in and the wonderful cultural area which we're sitting in this evening. If it were not for Jephthah Wade and these wonderful people, this would have all been a housing development. There would have been none of these cultural things here. And when I talk to conventions of people that come into Cleveland, they are just overwhelmed with our cultural area, University Circle, and that everything is here. So, food for thought. I thank you so very much. I thank you for the fire drill. I do have the pictures here. I'll keep them up for a while. I did write a book, as I mentioned, and that's available. Thank you.